My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kalima Horra on Almayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak Kalima Horra, and my audience does too. Kalima Horra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, coming from London but discussing, well, a truly global phenomenon. The subject of this debate is the rise and fall of populist leaders, of the likes of Boris Johnson, Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro. I'm putting a querulous note in my voice because, of course, all three of these politicians who have temporarily fallen may very well rise again. I myself have always wondered why people are accused of populism in a pejorative way. Oftentimes, I think what it represents is establishment politicians questioning why their rivals are more popular than them. Is populism necessarily a right-wing phenomenon? And what would right-wing have to mean in that case? Is Donald Trump right-wing? Well, under Donald Trump, there were no new wars started in his presidential term, and he is pledging to end the wars that are currently raging. Is that right-wing? Is it therefore left-wing to be starting wars and supporting them? It makes you think, doesn't it? Boris Johnson was the leader of the ultimate establishment political party, but he took that party into places in the United Kingdom that the Conservative Party had literally never been before. He won seats in former Labour heartlands, working class strongholds that quite likely no other Conservative politician could possibly have done. Lula started out as a trade union leader, a socialist firebrand, and ended up as the candidate supported by the US State Department and the White House of Joe Biden, and has now begun cracking down on free speech on the internet. So who's left? Who's right? Who's populist? Who's popular? I have my own views. They'll emerge in the course of the discussion. But I'm joined by distinguished experts. I'm only the enthusiastic amateur. On my left is possibly the most successful populist politician in Britain today. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, he's a very good friend of mine since he was 15 years old. He was the youngest councillor elected in London. He's now the leader of the opposition in an important London borough, and his grandmother has joined him as an independent councillor, keeping it in the family, but exceedingly popular because they say and they do what the populace wants them to do. Is that populism, James?
Well, it's an interesting debate, isn't it, really? Because you're quite right. The media establishment politicians often like to use the term populism as a negative one, as one with negative connotations to throw about and bandy about at their rivals. But actually, at its heart, populism relies upon politicians doing what their people, as you say, the populace, demand of them. That's what we did where I am in southwest London, and people have responded very positively to that. I don't think it's as simple as a case of left-wing right-wing. Arguably, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK represented some form of populism. You've got masses of people chanting at festivals under his leadership, his name in support of him. That was, by all senses, a populist leader campaign seeking to actually implement policies that the masses wanted. It's a fascinating one, actually, I think. When it comes to the likes of Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and we'll come into more detail about their rise and fall, I'm sure, during the debate, ultimately it relied upon a population that felt left behind. And that's what I experienced in southwest London. It's what Boris Johnson found across the country in Britain, and it's what Donald Trump found across the country in America. A disconnect between the ruling elite and the people that they are supposed to serve. The concept of public servant, I think, has fallen out of fashion in recent years by those in power. At the end of the day, people that go into politics to represent the masses are public servants. They're there to give their lives to public service. And I think too often ruling politicians forget that these days.
That's true, isn't it? Robert Oulds of the Bruges Group, a think tank based in the United Kingdom, that the political establishment doesn't like populists because they would prefer to govern as experts, as the people who know best. And they consider the population that they serve as rather vulgar.
Well, populism and populist is a pejorative term looking for a definition, but you're right there in terms of we have this growth of technocratic government. We have in the United States rule by agency, or in Europe ruled by the institutions of the European Union and bureaucrats, people that haven't been elected, and the civil servants running affairs, telling elected leaders what to do. But we have a situation where really corporate elites are driving this, and in a sense imposing a demographic revolution in terms of mass immigration, an energy-based revolution in terms of getting rid of fossil fuels and replacing that with renewables, which do not essentially work, not yet anyway. And anyone who speaks up about this, they're, of course, going against what an establishment want, and so they are labelled as populists, as if they are the revolutionary for saying, actually, we don't want these changes, we didn't vote for this, we didn't approve this, you haven't actually asked us. And those people are then treated as if they are some kind of pariah, and that's a political tactic, and as if they are not allowed to have their say because the decisions have already been taken behind closed doors and people cannot have their point of view expressed.
And that has seeded the ground, hasn't it, for the rise of populists. This sense amongst the electorate that politicians are a class apart, who do what they want to do, not what the people who elected them want them to do.
Well, that's precisely the point. I think in the case of Trump and Bolsonaro is a perfect example of where democracy is failing in those countries. Because look at the choice that the Americans had. It was between Trump on the one hand with his right off-the-scale views, and on the other hand, Mrs. Clinton, who with her sense of entitlement. Not particularly surprising that the popular vote of the United States went the way it did. And in the case of Bolsonaro, exactly the same thing. What was Bolsonaro up against? The corrupt socialist predecessors. He played the forceful people's representative in a very down-to-earth sort of way, rather like Trump. And basically what they both represent is a failure of democracy in the West to develop properly and create channels through which the good people could come into politics, particularly responding to the will of the public.
Jacques, you and I sat in Parliament together for some years. There were what I will call real parliamentarians in those days. But when I look at the Parliament today, they might as well be speak your weight machines. They do what they are told in the way that Robert said. You know exactly what they're going to say when they stand up. When we joined Parliament, there was well over 100 people that when they rose to speak, you had no idea what line they were going to take on an issue. There was an independence of mind then, which there isn't now in the political class right across the Western world.
And the reason, basically, is the way the major parties select their candidates. It's in this. I know in the Conservative Party from 1945, selection was by merit. It has now become a matter of ticking boxes to get the right groups of ethnicity, of women into Parliament and the like. Merit seems to have gone out of the window, and it's beginning to affect Parliament itself and the quality of the members there, and therefore they're expressing their particular points of view.
Now, you mentioned Bolsonaro. Our next guest is an expert in Latin America himself, Francisco Dominguez, who is the head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University in London. Dr. Francisco, welcome back to the show.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Doctor, what is it about populist leaders that resonates with the people?
Yeah, traditionally what it is, and this applies to the current situation, is that they give simplistic answers to complex questions. And the simplistic answers tend to play on prejudice of every imaginable kind. So, for example, whenever there is unemployment, then they seek to blame immigrants. And the solution is to expel them, not to get them in, not to allow them in, to persecute them, to harass them, and so on. The second one is when people are suffering poverty, they go for welfare state scrounges, as they call them in the media. And then there is a huge persecution. And normally, this is always has some racial connotations. The scrounges tend to be dark-skinned, and they tend to be from somewhere else, and so on. Then there is the question of when there is crime, huge levels of crime in some societies as a consequence of the crisis that they create. Then they blame on, they try to take very harsh measures on crime. So they stop and search and, pass legislation, which is very restrictive, and so on. And all of this actually, I think it works pretty well, not necessarily successfully all the time, but pretty well because in advanced European countries, including the UK, there is an imperialist past. And the people here who are supposed to be the ones that are to be protected by these harsh measures, by these simplistic answers, then they feel that they are being protected by thinking or be made to think that they are superior. And as a result of that, this is the way it works. And when it comes to, it's been the case here, things such as sexual diversity and so on, then they play on fears, which are usually conservative, got to do with religious connotations and so on. And this is certainly the case, not only here, but certainly in the United States, where religion and religious prejudices and prejudices in general play a much more significant role. So that's why I think no matter where and whenever there is a crisis, this will resonate with ordinary people.
It seems that populist leaders gain traction at the beginning of their campaigns, their elections, their victories, but they fizzle out, really. They lose support. Why?
I think it depends where. In the case of Europe, because I want to make a distinction between Europe and, say, Latin America. In the case of Europe, what you have now is the crisis that has been created has produced two, I would say, interconnected phenomena. On the one hand, you have the traditional right that is moved more to the right and it's become completely neoliberal. And then you have social democracy, which is, the traditional mass left parties in Europe, that they've abandoned their social democracy and they've joined the ranks of neoliberalism. And as a consequence, people feel that there is nothing that defends them until somebody else comes up with these simplistic answers. And therefore, that's when they become successful. But The trouble is, and this applies particularly to places such as Latin America, is they're not able to consolidate their gains. That is to say, they're able to get to office, in some cases to power, but normally to office, but because they have very little to offer and they fail miserably in addressing and resolving those issues that they raised in the first place, then the result is they're left wanting and they lose their power, and then they produce crises in their own political parties, and they tend to lose elections. So they tend to be removed by others who may be worse or better, depends on the political situation in the specific countries.
It's a bit of a vicious circle, isn't it? Populist leaders rise, then they fall, but then they show every sign of perhaps rising again, and if not they, their surrogates.
I think we face a particular situation right now different from previous crises, and it's this. What you have now is a geopolitical transformation of the world. It's not just a crisis in specific areas or countries, but it is a crisis which is producing a multipolar world. And in that context, you have, to simplify the phenomenon, which is much more complex, you have the rise of China that offers one alternative of going forward, and you have the severe decline of the United States that Europe is declining very badly. So in that context, what you have is the possibility of something new emerging. But when the new cannot yet be born and the old doesn't really go away, doesn't die, that's when you have this crisis. And that space, that gap, is filled by monstrosities. And this is, I think, the situation we face. So there is a possibility, not the certainty, there is a possibility that they come back. In the case of the United States, to be precise about that, Trump is losing his steam. There is no question about it. And there is this massive offensive at the level of democratic rights, at the level of liberal principles and so on by the Democratic Party, particularly, and this is very interesting for me, particularly from the Black leadership that is emerging in the United States within the Democratic Party. The leader of the House of Representatives, for example, is a guy called Hakeem Jeffries, who is extremely articulate. I've listened to his speeches. My God, we would like to have politicians like that. And in places such as Georgia, which is an emblematic place, you have women such as Stacey Abrams, who was a mayor, and he wanted to be a member of parliament, and she failed to succeed. But she is there, influencing things. So that's why Trump was found wanting, and particularly his attempt to wage a coup d'etat backfired very badly, and he hasn't been able to recover. He's trying desperately now, but he can't do it.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, Robert. But going back to one of the things Dr. Francisco said, he accused populists of coming forward with simple answers. But some answers are simple. Some questions are binary. We were involved in one in the Brexit issue. It was a simple question. Do you want to be ruled by the European Union, or do you want to have independence and self-government? More controversially, it's a simple question whether we should be allowing the best part of 100,000 illegal immigrants to cross the English Channel in rubber dinghies. All of the political class want to turn their face away from that question, leaving the ground open for populists like Nigel Farage to say, this is simple, we have to stop it. Isn't it like a sneer to accuse people of coming forward with simple answers?
Well, you can understand this in a sense of economic change. Once there was a marketplace of ideas, and new ideas were welcome, and there was an adversarial system where people could challenge other people's ideas and put forward solutions, and other people might have different ideas, and we would debate them out and argue them. That's sort of, in a sense, how the economy works, is how the legal system works, is how the political system, at least in the UK, would work. But since then, we've had a sort of growth of managerialism. We've had a growth of a service-based economy. And sort of previous masculine arguments over who was right and taking different positions, that's now, in a sense, that world has, in a sense, gone, because we have a consensus building. We have, if someone puts forward a different point of view, be that in an office or in the political system, then they can be said, oh, you're being divisive. We have a sort of situation now where a service-based economy, where there's not really any real industry or inventiveness, there's just a supply of services, and in a sense it's dominated by more feminine thinking, in a sense, which is all about consensus building. And so we have a situation where those who put forward ideas are somehow anathema. They are not welcome in that kind of structure. And we'd like to think, some people may think that populists are somehow right-wing, and to oppose them is to be left-wing and socialist. But really, they're just playing along with an agenda driven by corporates that just want everybody to get along and don't want any divisiveness, because then there can be active trade unions. There may be policies that come forward that aren't in their interest. They're happy with the situation where they're rent-seeking, and they want everybody just to ignore any substantial issue and just focus with getting on with them lives and being good consumers and good obedient workers. And that's what's really driving this. It's a corporate agenda that doesn't want to have new ideas, because that can affect a rent-seeking company's profit margins.
Divisive, James, is, of course, a regular jibe thrown at the populist. I've never, again, understood that, because politics is, of its very essence, divisive. You go that way or you go that way. You go forward or you go back. These are divisive issues. Are you accused of divisiveness in Kingston?
I've often been accused of divisiveness, but when someone goes to vote, they are making a decision. Politics is a divisive thing. I think the bigger question for me when it comes to, and perhaps where I disagree with the doctor slightly, is in terms of the cycle of populism and populists. The challenge, as I see it, is when the outsiders that have secured that mandate, that have got the popular support, in turn become the insiders. Because it's all very well and good for me as an opposition leader, and for people in the UK like Nigel Farage, being able to resonate with the masses, be able to share views that resonate with people. But the challenge is, as I think Boris Johnson found once he was in government, once you've got the bureaucracy, the technocrats around you trying to pull you in one direction or another, telling you what to say, what to do, what to think, it can often be difficult to keep that populist flair going. And I think, as we saw with Boris Johnson over things like Brexit, his oven-ready deal he promised during the 2019 election, which saw him elected with a landslide majority, which very soon sort of crumbled away into pieces. And that, for me, is the bigger challenge for populism, is it's translating it from being elected on a platform to actually delivering that platform. And when populist politicians don't deliver on their promises and don't deliver their platform, that's when people actually just view them as, we're one and the same. Politicians are all the same. Why should I bother voting? It doesn't make a difference.
Equally, though, and I would say this is certainly true of Trump, he unexpectedly won, and the deep state never allowed him to govern. They immediately assailed him on the bogus Russiagate allegations. They basically robbed at least half of his presidential term, and then COVID arguably robbed him of the other half. So the populist coming into power has to govern with a bureaucracy, with a deep state that hates them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, you're quite right. And if they're to do that effectively, they need to have the strongest of teams around them. And in Britain, Dominic Cummings, who was Boris Johnson's chief advisor, loathed by vast swathes of the political class and the elite, and arguably did, a number of questionable things, but he was resolute in his determination that the civil service would not run roughshod over the government's policy, and, to use a Trump phrase, did try to drain the swamp, albeit as time proved unsuccessfully.
Yeah, the swamp overwhelmed him too. We'll be right back with more of this after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, coming from London, discussing populism. You know, the blonde bombshells that explode on the political scene in Western countries only to fizzle out and die, although sometimes they can come back. And if we're talking about that, the post-Boris Johnson experience of the British Conservative Party has been a pretty miserable one. I've lost count of the number of prime ministers and top ministers that they have had, but their fortunes have continued to plummet. I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I might bet on Boris Johnson coming back, wouldn't you?
Well, there was rumours of a comeback. He has claimed to had the votes to retake the Conservative leadership, or at least get into the vote of members, which probably elected him. And he is still popular amongst large sections of the country, and there is a campaign to bring him back. Of course, the time is probably too late for him now, and he may indeed want to go on and pursue other things. Of course, the time since Boris Johnson left hasn't been happy, but they weren't completely happy times when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. But of course, we had Liz Truss come in. She was ruled as in office rather for 45 days and then had to resign. Now, of course, we're beginning to learn that a lot of her ideas were actually, in some degrees, correct, just a little bit too early and poorly implemented. And there we have, to some degree, an understanding that sometimes the populist may not be, or not the populist, but the inexperienced politician may not be the best placed person to run things, because there was a degree when Liz Truss was in charge of unprofessionalism, of amateurism, of not consulting with colleagues, not building consensus within her own party, and just not being properly prepared in terms of, actually, if we're going to make cuts in terms of taxes, we need to make cuts in terms of public expenditure and balance the books. Wasn't really properly prepared. So there was a degree of amateurism, and that's why, in some cases, leaders who are new and come to power may not indeed last, because they may not just have the technocratic skills that are needed, but of course the technocrats shouldn't be in charge. They should be advising and warning and making recommendations and ultimately implementing what democratic leaders have asked for. But too often, unfortunately, they seem to be taking the power, making the decisions themselves. They should be listened to, but not actually ruling, as indeed they possibly are at the moment.
Probably are at the moment. Rishi Sunak is as clear a picture of the machine as it's almost possible to imagine. Maybe Boris Johnson won't come back, but I'd put money on Donald Trump coming back. I totally disagreed with Dr. Francisco. Joe Biden has been a complete and almost unmitigated disaster. And yet, apparently, 81 million people voted for him. I've got my doubts about that also. I think that Trump will come back, and the populist message that he's refining now, well, it even gets my blood coursing faster through my veins. Do you think Trump can make a comeback?
I think he might, but I suspect the Republican Party is actually moving on. But let us look at our own case. What happened to Boris? Boris won a very large majority. Why? Because he absolutely defined the issues that were concerning the British public. They wanted Brexit done on the one hand, and they certainly didn't want Jeremy Corbyn and all his left-wing extremist nonsense. Boris's problem was, first he was hit by COVID himself physically. He never had a period of recuperation to overcome COVID, which nearly took him away permanently. He devised all the necessary to get the vaccines produced, the vaccination program undertaken, and then of course he had the Ukraine war on top. Boris's problem was he was never able to implement the very things that he'd proposed to do at the general election. I think it's disturbing that we've got the downside of Brexit, which we all knew was facing us, but only belatedly are there moves now to make sure that we have the upside of Brexit, the opportunities of less regulation, less control, and better international trade. So basically, what Boris has proved to his successors is you need a personality to get across in politics, and it is doubtful his two successors were strong in that particular regard.
Let's go to a man who's seen it all, a legendary Fleet Street editor and hard-bitten journalist, now in Marrakesh in Morocco. Who wouldn't be if they could? It is Martin R.J., the editor of Maghrebi.org. Martin, great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
What makes these populist leaders so successful?
Yeah, it's difficult to put your finger on it because I think there isn't a common theme which runs through all of them, but there are some themes which keep emerging. And I think when we look at the rise of Trump, or Trumpism, if you like, there are a few things which resonate, which you can't help but noticing. I think with many of these leaders, they have a knack of really listening to the man in the pub, the man in the street, if you like. And the fact that mainstream politicians have stopped doing this, I think there's a deficit there, which the populist leaders tend to take up the slack on. They listen to the man in the street. They identify oversimplified, unnuanced messages, and they reprocess and repackage those messages in a certain way, like an echo box, and hope that they will have some success with that with common people, simply because the numbers are so great. When these messages, these simplified messages, these very unnuanced demands from voters who are losing confidence in the status quo in many of these countries.
Are the mainstream political parties therefore to blame by their failures for the rise of these populist leaders?
I think they capitalize on the fact that people all around the world, not just in the West, but in the global South as well, are getting tired of political systems which seem to be stagnating, which seem to be running aground. In Europe, in Britain, we always look down on the European Union countries. We always look down on the continent as poor governance countries, Italy and Spain, Mediterranean countries, more so than perhaps France and Germany. But in fact, the phenomenon came to Britain, it came to UK. And the turning point, I think, for many journalists who were following it was probably the swing from a conservative government of John Major to Tony Blair coming into power in 1997. What you saw there were the seesaw that we've seen for so long in British politics between the two groups, which I think people are getting tired of finally, because we're beginning to see less and less difference between the two groups. People are beginning to realize that it's just really one group. And I think in America, America took some time to look at seeing, could the model be broken? Could a new model replace the status quo of Democrats and Republicans? And I think that came about when Trump came to power. People, that phrase that he came up with of draining the swamp of Washington really resonated. That really, millions and millions of people in one go. Many Democrats who were tired of the Clinton dynasty. It just represented corruption incorporated, and the idea of draining the swamp, the idea of having non-professionals, if that's the right expression, people from a non-political background, at that time seemed very refreshing. So it's populism, in my view, is really about protest votes from people who have lost confidence in their political systems.
Some of these leaders talk in public as if they were in private and say things, do things that are usually only said and done in private. Is this a deliberate technique, a tactic to kind of take the public's breath away at their frankness, their boldness?
No, I think the difference is between the old and the new, between the populist and the non-populist, is that populist leaders don't really have any time for conventional orthodox management. They don't really want to manage. They don't really want to govern. They don't really know how to, in many cases, and they believe that if they can reach out to the man in the street with these simplified messages, these one-shot silver bullet solutions, whether it's to the economy or climate change or immigration, they believe if they can reach out, then they won't have to govern. It's a kind of a vote, in my view, for non-government governance, rather than incredibly poor governance. You replace one with the other. So I don't know about private and public messages. I think the message that populist leaders come out with are really a way of distracting people from looking at the fact that they are not really running the show. They're not really governing in the conventional sense. It's a non-government government situation. And I think part of the populist thing, part of the phenomenon of populist leaders is that they take advantage of the demise of journalism. And I'm old enough to remember when journalism was a profession and a very respected profession. In the last 30 years, it's just plummeted and plummeted. And we're at the stage now with media where populist leaders, I think, see a real opportunity to hijack media for their own cause and steer media down the road of just following the subjects that those leaders want to be followed, which is usually very, very short polemic sound bites delivered via Twitter or social media, rather than doing their jobs and holding these politicians to account.
Can we expect the era of the likes of Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro to be over, or might they stage a comeback?
No, I think they will come back. I don't necessarily think they will come back as a massive wave, which is a global phenomenon. I think it will depend on the region of the world you're in and the various dynamics that are going on politically. But if you talk about Boris, I have no doubt whatsoever he will be the opposition the opposition leader at the next general election in the UK, because I can't imagine the Tories under any circumstances winning again. Trump probably won't make it to 2024, but Trumpism will. And I think that's the thing to look out for with a lot of these populist leaders. They may not necessarily come back themselves, but in America, definitely Trumpism is alive and well. And I think it will give Biden a real run for his money at the next presidential elections there, because I think people sometimes reach out for populist leaders because they're also tired of the blah, blah, blah of daily business in White House or Downing Street or wherever, and want huge, fundamental, single issues tackled just in one term of office. And I think that may well be in America, the Ukraine war. I think there's enough people in America who don't want the Ukraine war to continue. So that may well fuel the Trump character, whoever it is. Probably not him, but I think Trumpism is certainly coming back in America.
James, isn't it? I mean, all of my life, it has been the prevailing orthodoxy that the Western democratic system was A, the best system, and B, was going to last forever, and that, in fact, we should export it to other countries, even at the point of a gun. But the more we've talked and the more we've heard, isn't it the case that people have lost faith in this Western democratic system where Tweedledee fights Tweedledum, pretends to hate him, when in fact they're two cheeks of the same backside?
I think you're right to an extent. I mean, here in the UK, 2/3 of people do not vote in local elections. And the reason that politicians regularly hear is you're all the same. Why should we bother? And that's why when politicians come along, and let's not escape the fact that they are still politicians, but saying something that's just that little bit different, that can infuse the masses, they're often willing to give it a go. Take Boris Johnson, Trump and Bolsonaro as but 3 examples. In France, Marine Le Pen successively in every French presidential election has increased her share of the vote for the populist Front National. And that's because more and more people are fed up with the two cheeks of the same backside approach that mainstream parties offer. In terms of what an alternative would be, I don't know. But in countries where ordinary citizens, ordinary people, are able to put initiatives onto ballots, are able to use more direct forms of democracy, they tend to be places where we get more democratic engagement, more people turning out to vote because they feel that they are involved in the process.
It's true, Robert, that if the next general election in Britain is between somebody called Rishi Sunak and somebody called Keir Starmer, it'll be the least exciting, enticing general election, certainly of my lifetime. Two cheeks of the same backside doesn't even begin to approach it. It, therefore, is a disengaging factor that the mainstream parties in Western democracies have become so poorly performing, and they throw sand in your eyes by saying that's too simplistic. It's much more nuanced than that. It's much more complicated than that. Well, why should people turn out to vote in such a political system?
Well, indeed, it's completely disengaging. And Keir Starmer himself, Sir Keir Starmer rather, doesn't like Westminster. He finds it too adversarial. He was asked, do you prefer Davos, where the World Economic Forum, essentially a high-powered think tank, meets, or do you prefer Westminster? He said Davos because there's like-minded people and they can agree. You have this consensus, and the battle of ideas doesn't really exist. They don't want that. They want to keep away from there being a competition. They want to have it essentially where there is a replacement of one with a like-minded political party. And they all want to get on. Rishi Sunak has had his entire career, he's wanted to get on and ingratiate himself with the establishment. Sir Keir Starmer was always part of the establishment when he was Director of Public Prosecutions or a lawyer. There isn't a great deal between them ideologically. They have essentially the same policies, high tax, high spend. They will argue amongst themselves, but really they're putting the same agenda forward. And that's the system that we have. And then that's partly driven by the electoral system, which doesn't allow new entrants, but it's also partly driven by a simplification of politics, which the media is also to blame, because we have this term, the mainstream media. The mainstream media are not the mainstream media. They are essentially vehicles for advertising, and they're only looking for the engagement of a very small section of the public, which they want to engage, they want to motivate to get the advertising revenue, to get the clicks. So the media now is providing clickbait. It's not providing discussion. There's not any information from the media of value. There aren't particular different points of view that are worthwhile or discussion of real issues. It is essentially just trying to engage a small population, small percentage, often a wealthy percentage of the population, which have certain prejudices against another group, for instance, in terms of what they want in terms of their policies, and they just want to engage them and get clickbait. They don't want to have investigations. Journalists are often now not as well paid as they were. There isn't the money in newspapers to fund proper research or investigative journalism. There is just the idea we must get clickbait, we must get engagement. So again, the newspapers are only talking to a small percentage of the population and only have journalists from a small percentage of the population. So you don't get this discussion of ideas. There's nothing to talk about.
And newspapers are far less significant than they were in the total media market, as are the formerly dominant television companies. Actually, hardly anyone's reading the newspapers and hardly anyone's watching the so-called mainstream television below a certain age. I mean, someone like my mother, who's 88 years old, she gets all of her news from the mainstream. But even her adult children now get virtually none of our news from the mainstream. Is it a coincidence, Jacques, that as the political class has shrunk and become dwarfish, so has the mass media that serves it? Was that a coincidence? Did one beget the other?
It probably did. And what is distressing is there's nothing intrinsically wrong with our democratic and parliamentary system. What is wrong is the practicing of it. That is why we're getting rather bland candidates, and they're moving up the system on a careerist basis. And basically, we're not getting across the views which the great public want necessarily to hear. Hence the comment about populism. If you take Boris Johnson, for instance, he has come in from journalism, but he came in with a message and an understanding that the public wanted to hear what the messages were and wanted implementation. For reasons I explained, he fell short on implementation, which probably did a fair amount to his overthrow in due course. But until we get proper politicians coming in, people of merit, we're going to continue with the problems we have.
I've got no candle to hold for Boris Johnson. I despise the man. But you could say that he was overcome by the swamp in the same way that that Donald Trump was. And he made the grotesque mistake of driving out the Dominic Cummings that you mentioned earlier. One hears because his wife didn't like him, in which case he's more stupid than I thought he was. But the swamp made sure that none of Johnson's populist rhetoric and promises ever saw the light of day.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the biggest issue that we have, not just in the UK, but in many countries in the West, is the system is stacked against insurgent candidates. It's stacked against the outsider. If we want more people coming forward, a higher class of people, our system isn't conducive to allowing that. In France, all of the candidates for president advanced to a second round. The top two candidates advanced to a second round where it's put to the French people. And so you always end up, as we have for the last 20 years, with a mainstream candidate versus the outsider. And more people are opting for the outsider, but they're still locked out. In the UK, our first-past-the-post system heavily gives preference to established parties who put up often the equivalent of my neighbour's cat with the equivalent party rosette on, and people will then vote for it. You know, you may as well, in many cases, put up a cat, a dog, a donkey. They'd do just as much good as the people being elected to the British Parliament. And so unless we fundamentally change the way we look at electoral politics and look at the way we elect our public servants, and unless people feel that they are getting service from the people they're electing, we won't be able to actually change the system we're in and get a high class of people elected.
Of course, the only people who could change that system are the beneficiaries of the existing system. The donkeys are in charge of the donkey sanctuary. It's been marvellous. We could have gone on much longer. I've got people trying to speak, but we've run out of time. I hope you found it interesting as we discussed populism. Thanks for watching Kalima Horra.